know, we have just one presentation or program after this one. We'll get to that in just a minute. As always, we want to start with a big thank you to our sponsor, because their contributions are what make these programs possible throughout the year. So we really appreciate all they do for us. Criteria making it happen for us with their exclusive dealership of these lovely cars here in Savannah. They've been very dedicated as a sponsor to us for a long time, so we really appreciate them. They're a platinum sponsor, and similarly, Planters Inn is also a platinum sponsor for us. Our guests stay there, among other things. It's a lovely inn in downtown Savannah, so we hope in your appreciation for these programs, you might send your guests there, or otherwise express some support for these local businesses. And finally, today, it's very difficult to read in this situation, but our April sponsor, so the sponsorship for this particular program is appropriately the World Trade Center Savannah. As you can see here, it encourages trade development to help attract jobs and investment in the area of Savannah. They do a lot of interesting things related to trade and, as I said, development strategies and information for people trying to invest in Savannah. So thank you, the World Trade Center of Savannah. Is this mic going in and out? Yes. Yes, sounds like it is. Let's try this one. Can you hear this one? Yes. Okay, we'll go with this one. So my apologies. We will have this audio straightened out by September, come hell or high water, because we are tired of that. Anyway, finally, just before we get to our speaker, we have this notification for our next and last program for this season on U.S. and Europe relations. Philip Brinker is coming to talk with us, and Larry has thankfully given us dates for the fall, so you can add those to your calendar right away so nobody misses those. Before we go on, however, I would like to make one small announcement, because as virtually all of you know, we moved our location from Skidaway Island back to downtown Savannah for a number of reasons, but not everyone who lives on Skidaway loves to drive and go back at night. So as a trial run for this program, May 22nd, the Savannah Council on World Affairs is going to provide free bus transportation only for 15 people from Skidaway Island to the program and back. Absolutely free, as a way to gauge interest in this trolley bus idea. So if you're interested in coming to the May program on this bus, please send an email to the Savannah Council on World Affairs Gmail account with the subject line, bus reservation, and we'll put you on the list. There is room, as I said, for only 15 people, so if you're interested, please let us know. So, if that works, then in the fall, we'll have this trolley, and there will be some charge of possibly $15 a person. I'm not sure of exact details, but I think that's what it is. All that said, so we are ready for our speaker tonight. Doesn't Larry do a fabulous job providing us with very timely topics? I love that. All that happens here. Anyway, Peter Harrell is coming to talk with us about trade wars. As you can see, he's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, former senior director of international economics at the National Security Council and at the National Economic Council in the White House. So, very appropriate background to speak on this topic, and we'd love to welcome you to the stage.
So I guess I'm going to hold this mic right in front of my mouth, so I will try to endeavor to do that so that everyone can hear me. And Jennifer, I want to thank you very much for the introduction. It is great to be here in Savannah. I really love this city. It's a beautiful city. I'm usually here in the summer because my mother-in-law actually lives up on Hilton Head. And we take the kids to visit her, and so usually when I come down here, it's like 96 degrees in the middle of July, and it's really nice to be here on such a beautiful, beautiful afternoon. I also want to thank Larry Silverman in particular for inviting me down here. Larry and I worked together, not on this sort of short bio, but my first job in government, I've spent, I guess, almost 15 years in government, some time out of government, was at the State Department. And at that time, Larry was handling a lot of Middle East policy, and I was handling economic policy. And at that time, a lot of our economic policy meant things like sanctions on Iran and on ISIS terrorist groups in Syria, and really got to know him through that. And I have to say, especially as somebody who was early in my career then, sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, I just learned so much about what a diplomat does, which is not something that they teach you in school. They don't really teach you what a diplomat does. And my takeaway from watching both Larry and some of the other senior folks in the Foreign Service is that when you are a diplomat, there's a policy role. Of course, you're talking about doing policy, but you also have the best sales job in the world. You are selling the vision and values of the United States of America. And even for all the challenges our country has from time to time, that's the best product you could possibly be out there selling. And Larry really did a fantastic job of doing that during his career at State. And I certainly learned a lot from him and his colleagues, and so really now appreciate the chance to be down here. But I'm not here to talk about diplomacy, or at least not really. I'm here to talk about trade and tariffs. Now, I think that probably if any of you have watched the TV news, seen the online news, maybe watched your investment portfolios, anything like that over the last couple of months, you may have noticed there's been a lot going on with trade and tariffs. And I think it is fair to say, we'll talk about the pros and cons and what's being achieved. I think it is fair to say, whether you like it or not, whether you think it is a good thing or not, President Trump is in the middle of pushing through the most dramatic change to U.S. and international trade policy in many decades. And we can talk a little bit about what he's trying to achieve, whether it's going to work, whether it's not, but I think we have to see this as 5 or 6 years from now, the trading system is going to look very different than it did a couple of years ago. And there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers from that. And I think particularly for a city like Savannah, where you have one of the 3 or 4 biggest ports in the country, and a state like Georgia, but very much including here in Savannah, where you have the Hyundai plant, you have Gulfstream, you have a lot of agricultural exports. Trade has been very important and is very important to the economy of this area and to the state as a whole. These changes are going to matter. It's going to be something people are going to see in the businesses you work with. It's going to matter in the what gets built here versus what we import. And it's going to matter sort of in our day-to-day lives as we see impacts on consumer goods and on prices. So I want to take some time tonight to talk about 3 major topics on trade policy. So first I want to talk about how we got here. Like, why did we build the trading system? And how did we build the trading system that Trump is now disrupting? Then I want to talk about what exactly is it that Trump has actually done. There have been dozens of trade announcements over the last couple of months, and I want to kind of break down a little bit of just what exactly has he done. And then I want to talk about what do I think he is trying to achieve, and where might this actually go? And where is he actually going to take us as we get through this disruptive period? So how did we get here? What is the system that Trump is now disrupting? And why did we create it going back to really the trading system that he's now disrupting is one we created at the end of World War II. Now, when you think about trade going back even earlier than World War II, of course, trade's been with the United States since its very beginning. I mean, Savannah, Charleston, these were ports in colonial times. There's trade coming in and out of these ports since before we had a country of our own. And we were trading with the Caribbean, we were trading with Europe, we were trading with Africa, obviously, as well, in slaves and in products. We were trading with Britain, actually up in New England during colonial times. They were building ships. The British were then sailing all the way to Asia and back. So global trade has really been part of American history since before we were a country. And if you think about our own history as a country, there's kind of an argument that British or English at that time, trade and tariff policy was one of the things that drove us to become a country of our own, right? Particularly tariffs around tea and things like that up in Boston. So trade has very much been an important issue throughout American history. And the debate that we're seeing play out today between should we focus more on importing and exporting things and getting the lowest costs and the most access to foreign markets, versus should we be trying to make more here in the United States and have more self-reliance, that's a debate that has also gone back to the very early days of our country. If anyone here see the musical Hamilton or the TV version or movie version, so Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were having exactly this debate. Hamilton wanted to raise tariffs because he wanted to promote industrialization here in the United States. Jefferson, being a large farmer, wanted to open markets to his products. Jefferson also loved French wine. He actually, 1787, took a trip to France, brought back 600 casks of wine. He probably didn't want to pay tariffs on that at the time. So, this whole debate has gone back really quite some time in our country. And if you look at kind of the history of tariffs in the U.S., you've seen periods where we've had quite high tariffs. For most of the 19th century, as President Trump likes to talk about, especially at the end of the 19th century, we actually had quite high tariffs. And tariffs for most of the 19th century made up more than half of all of the federal government's tax revenue. So it was actually most of how the federal government was getting taxes. And then we've had periods in our country, sort of in the post-World War II era, and particularly in the 90s to kind of a few years ago, where we had really very few tariffs here in the United States. So we've had these debates going back quite some time. But I think the modern trading order, the one Trump is now disrupting, really traces its roots to the end of World War II, not quite actually after World War II, actually beginning in 1944, 1945, when some of Roosevelt's team and some of the British and some of the other Allied powers realized we're going to win this war, and we have to think about what does a post-war world look like. And some of that security, you sort of see this, the Soviet bloc's going to be on the other side of the line after World War II, so you think about security. You're also thinking about economics. And if you go back and you read the history from that time, from the 40s and late 40s, what you see is the policymakers building the kind of post-war economic order where they brought down a bunch of tariffs to quite low levels over time, had kind of two big sets of goals. The first big set of goals was an economic set of goals. The U.S. at the time, right, we're in World War II, we're producing a bunch of tanks, or producing a bunch of airplanes. The end of the war, you're not going to need all that much of that stuff here in the United States anymore. So what's one of the things you might want to do with a bunch of your industrial capacity? You're going to turn all this stuff into civilian goods, and you're going to try and sell it around the world. So sort of from an economic perspective, the end of World War II, American policymakers think, what we need to do is export a lot of stuff, and we want to push down tariffs around the world because we're the big manufacturing power, and we want to push our stuff out onto global markets. And of course, there was this memory from the Great Depression. At that point, just a few years prior, you had the Great Depression. There was this memory that the tariff hikes of the 1930s, something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which if you've ever seen the movie Ferris Bueller, you might remember the Ben Stein character talking about it. There was a sense that tariff hikes had made the Great Depression much worse. And also we need to sell stuff around the world. So let's, from an economic theory, push for low tariff barriers around the world. And then there was also a geopolitical logic. If we're coming out of World War II, you'd had two wars in Europe in the last 30 years. You had World War I and World War II. And then we see that there's going to be the Soviet bloc emerging on the other side in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And so you're sort of thinking of, we've got an economic agenda for trade, We also have a geopolitical agenda. Let's pull this Western bloc together. Let's help rebuild and integrate Europe economically so they don't have another war in Western Europe again. If we have trade and we sell Europe a bunch of stuff, that'll help them rebuild, which will be good for them. And also, as we think about our competition with the Soviets, we'll have a big trading bloc that'll make all of us richer and help us outcompete the Soviets kind of economically and technologically as well as militarily. So you have this sort of from the period of the late 40s through the early 1990s, this kind of vision of trade got codified in something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, which was this sort of Western bloc trading system that, again, brought down tariffs and kind of built this geopolitical bloc against the Soviets. Then, come 1989, Berlin Wall falls down, end of the Cold War. We have won the Cold War. And it looks like the kind of geopolitical arguments for that part of trade don't matter. And we actually don't want a block of countries anymore because the Soviets are no longer falling apart. They're no longer the enemy. You want to like promote trade globally, right? You want to have a global market. And you also in the 80s and 90s had this view in Washington shared by both President Reagan and President Clinton that a particular economic model of kind of free markets, less government regulation, and free trade would make both the U.S. and a bunch of our allies and partners, and the Soviet, or not Soviets, the Russians in Eastern Europe, and even the Chinese would make them richer. So in the 90s, you saw the creation of the World Trade Organization, which kind of set a set of global rules for ultimately more than 150 countries around, including the United States, around tariffs. And you saw the U.S. kind of take the base of the GATT and expand it out into the WTO. And in particular, there was a desire to think, well, we should bring China, and then eventually also Russia, we should bring them into this system. And if we bring China and Russia into this system, that's going to do two things. Again, as we saw in the 1940s, there's going to be an economic logic. Chinese market's going to grow. We're going to be able to sell more things to the Chinese. Also, even if maybe the Chinese will manufacture more things and sell them to us, but that's okay. Again, at the time, it was sort of thought, well, that might be okay because we will retrain our workers and we'll move up into new industries and new technologies like software. So economically, this is going to work for us. And then there was also a geopolitical argument again. And you go back and you read President Clinton's speeches about why he thought China should come into the WTO. And he's saying things like, look, what's going to happen in China is you're going to have a businessman, and that businessman is going to see his business grow, and he is going to realize he doesn't want an arbitrary government and a communist government that's going to take all that away from him. And so you're actually, by having economic reform in China, bringing them into the system, and having economic reform in China and deepening trade, the view at the time, in the late 1990s, was that was actually going to push China to liberalize, not just economically, but also politically, and ultimately come more our way. And so that was kind of the vision of the economic order that prevailed, frankly, until President Trump's first term, when he began his process of this great disruption of trade that we are now really seeing play out. But I think it's fair to say that when President Trump campaigned in 2016, he obviously was running against this order, this kind of WTO order, this free trade order. And why had this order become so unpopular? Well, it's fair to say this order was good in many ways. You saw aggregate global growth during that period. There was a lot of global growth during the 2000s and 2010s. There was a fair amount of U.S. GDP growth. We had recessions in 2008 and in 2001, but there's a fair amount of U.S. GDP growth. But if you kind of looked below the numbers, there was growing concern about some of the adverse economic impacts here in the United States of this order. So even though there was aggregate GDP growth between 2000, when China comes into the WTO, and 2016, the kind of median, the kind of middle class, the median household income was basically flat for that entire period. It went up maybe 2-3% over that whole time, adjusted for inflation. So there was a sense that this has been bad, or at least really not good for the middle class. So we're seeing a lot of GDP growth, and some wealthy people are doing very well. But there's a sense that fed into our politics that Trump capitalized on. This has been bad for the middle class. And then relatedly, there was more and more evidence coming out that China really had, bringing China into this system, really had hit US manufacturing fairly hard. And so if you look at US manufacturing as kind of a share of the economy and as a percentage of total employment, had been declining for quite some time, going back to the 1960s. We're becoming a more services economy. But if you looked at how many people are actually working in manufacturing jobs in this country, it had been stabilized at about 17, 18 million kind of through the 1980s and 1990s. Again, getting a little smaller as a share of population, but sort of stable as total number of manufacturing jobs. And then in the 2000s, that comes down to about 12 million. So you do actually see a decline of 5 million manufacturing jobs in the 2000s. And there's some economic studies that suggest maybe half of that was due to competition with China. So there's a sense of this hollowed out manufacturing jobs. And whereas the vision of the folks in the Clinton administration, I've interviewed, we know them, they interviewed them, the vision was, well, okay, maybe you lose a factory, but we'll retrain people. There'll be home health care aides, there'll be software coders, and a lot of that just didn't happen. A lot of the kind of promise of the upskilling and the upgrading of the jobs just didn't happen. So by the late 2010s, there's this kind of skepticism of, has the economic deal on balance really worked? We have a long debate about whether it did or not, but there's a skepticism out there about has it really worked. And then there's also, I think, undeniably, this idea that bringing China in and bringing Russia in was going to liberalize them and make them more politically like us. That was just a failure. That actually kind of worked during the 2000s. There was some political liberalization in China. There was some economic liberalization in China. But after Xi Jinping comes into power in China in 2012, really consolidates, you just see all that turning backward. You see a very clear direction that he is cracking down domestically, politically. He is getting more aggressive in his neighborhood, doing more and more saber rattling against Taiwan, against Japan. So this idea that China was going to become more like us and more friendly to us just didn't pan out. And so you're looking at this in 2015, 2016, you're like, well, the geopolitics of this have changed. This idea we're going to have one world trading system where China, and us are in sort of the same system, that's looking, I think, to Trump, but even like Hillary Clinton at the time, running against Trump, looking like maybe not the best idea. And then economically, you see all these questions coming up about whether it really was the right economic deal. So President Trump gets elected, campaigns on a fairly protectionist set of policies, and wins that election, and moves to implement his policies. And I want to talk a little bit briefly about what Trump did during his first term, and then in much more detail about what we have seen over the last, I think it's like 90 days since he has been. It's not 100 days at the end of the month. I mean, I saw that he gave some interview about his 100 days, and I realized reading the interview, it's not quite been 100 days, close enough. Something like 90 days he's had so far. So he runs for election on this protectionist agenda and a bunch of other things. Well, what does he do during his first term? Well, he really does, as I think of it, kind of three trade things during his first term. So he declares a trade war on China. He doesn't actually do that on day one. I think we look at what's going on now and we think, oh, it must have been very fast during the first term. It's actually much slower during the first term. So in 2017, he announces he's going to have his trade advisor investigate. This is his first year in office. He announces he's going to have his trade advisor investigate whether China's engaging in unfair trade practices and propose some tariffs and other policies if he finds they are engaging in unfair trade practices. And then in 2018, turns out the trade advisor says, yes, China is engaging in unfair trade practices. It's not actually that hard to show that, right? I mean, we all sort of know the subsidies and the IP theft and that kind of thing. And then between 2018 and early 2020, having found that China was engaging in these unfair trade practices, the US imposes tariffs of up to 25% on about 70 to 80% of everything we import from China. It doesn't all come in at once. It's kind of staggered in. They target some products and then some other products, and then there were some other tariffs that were slated to come in, and Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping have a kind of summit, and they strike this, what's called this phase one deal, where Trump basically says, well, I'll pause the next tariffs, and you guys in China are going to buy more stuff from the United States, and you're also going to make some commitments to give American companies better access to your market. So they strike what's called this phase one deal. That doesn't actually really get implemented, but then on the other hand, they strike this deal in January 2020. We can all kind of remember what else happened about a few months later in March 2020. So COVID hits, and we will get preoccupied by other things, but the tariffs stay in place. The upshot is the tariffs stay in place. There's one big category of stuff that we imported from China at the time that Trump doesn't tariff, and that's consumer electronics. It's iPhones, it's TVs, it's that kind of thing. And you ask the question, why didn't you tariff the iPhones and the TVs? And you could either argue it's because Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, met with Trump 13 times over the course of 3 or 4 months. You could also look at it as, and you can see this at the time, somebody in the administration, we don't ever know who, gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal, nameless basis, saying they've been arguing to Trump, you shouldn't ruin Christmas by tariffing all these electronics items that people want to buy for Christmas. Anyway, we cover most things, but not the electronics, because Trump's worried about the cost impacts, right? He's worried that on a couple of these things that people would really feel it with the tariffs. He decides to put that. So we have this, first thing we have this trade war with China, that tariffs come into place, strike a deal, but then it kind of COVID gets OB, makes all this a little bit OB. It's thing one Trump does during his first term. Thing two, and this is relevant to some of what we see playing out today, he decides, there are a couple of strategic products that we have lost the ability to make in America, or we are in the process of losing our ability to make in America. And I'm going to try to use tariffs to rebuild that particular industry, because that particular industry is important here in America. And the first and sort of biggest item he does that with in his first term, and we're going to see a lot more of this in term 2, is steel and aluminum. So he uses this kind of national security statute from the 1960s that lets you put tariffs in place if you think imports are threatening something that's important to the Defense Department. So tariff steel and aluminum so we can increase U.S. manufacturing of steel and aluminum. Sort of, and those products, those tariffs, Biden ends up changing them a little bit, but they get in place during Trump, then largely stay in place during Biden as well. And then the third thing Trump does is he rewrites the NAFTA trade agreement. The NAFTA trade agreement being one of Clinton's agreements with Canada and Mexico to integrate trade in North America with our neighbors. And Trump rewrites it, calls it the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA. A lot of it's the same deal, but there are some important differences. Which in Trump's mind, he wants to make this deal a little bit more, as he sees it, worker-friendly. And to give just 2 examples of what that means. And he also wants to do this, as he's thinking about China as advisors, he wants to make sort of North America a little bit more resistant to Chinese influence. So just to give 2 examples of things he did in rewriting USMCA. So first of all, he says, if you're building cars in Mexico, and you want to get tariff-free treatment for your cars in Mexico, you're Ford and you're building these things out in Mexico as opposed to the United States, you got to pay your workers in Mexico at least $16 an hour. And that idea there is to kind of bring up the wages there as a way of creating an incentive, relative incentive to keep it still more expensive to hire the workers here in Georgia or in Michigan, but the differential's a little bit smaller. So maybe that helps keep people here. If it doesn't help keep the jobs here, at least like Mexicans are earning better wages, and maybe they buy more of our stuff, right? So he does that to try to make USMCA a little bit more worker-friendly. And then the other thing he does is he says, look, if you're building, again, particularly in cars, but also some other products, if you're building them here, a lot of the parts have to be from North America. You can't just like import the transmission and the engine and the brakes and everything from China or Korea and then assemble it here. You actually have to have at least 75% of the parts have to come from North America. So he's trying to like make more of the assembly happen here, more of the parts, more of the value added coming in. So those are three things he does in his first term. Other smaller things, but those are three big things. So what do we see over the last 90 days? We see sort of what he did on the first term, but vastly bigger. So he has come in the last 90 days, and I'll lay out kind of a couple of the different things that he has done, starting back in February. So the first thing he did, starting back in February, is he came out and he said, I'm going to threaten tariffs of 20% on China, and then he actually imposed them on China, and of 25% on Canada and Mexico. All goods, not just some goods, all goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. He actually imposes them on China, and very briefly for a couple of days imposes them on Canada and Mexico. Now, what's interesting and different about this first round of tariffs that he does in his second term is, at least legally, you look at the documents he does, they're not about trade issues. They're about migration and fentanyl issues. So what he basically is saying this round of tariffs is to put pressure on the Chinese and on the Canadians and the Mexicans to get more serious about helping me dealing with America's fentanyl crisis and migration issues. And that's just different from anything he'd done during his first term, where all of his tariffs were basically about trade policy. Now, I think you can ask, was this just like pretext? Is he really cares about trade, but wants to cite fentanyl as a pretext? But like legally, they were about this geopolitical set of issues, not about trade issues. So we see that happen. Now, as I say, he puts the tariffs on China, 20% on everything, including the iPhones, including the stuff that he doesn't hit during his first term. And because it includes the stuff he doesn't hit during his first term, he has actually put more tariffs on China in his second term than he did in all of his first term. And we're only 90 days in. And that was before we got to the tariffs a couple of weeks ago, where he takes these rates through the roof. And then he puts these tariffs 25% on Canada and Mexico, and the market's greater, because we're actually very integrated as a North American economy. And all of a sudden, car makers and lumber importers and home builders my God, I can't pay 25% tariffs, so stocks sell off and people start complaining. So he immediately starts saying, well, for goods that comply with this USMCA trade agreement, no tariffs on this, by and large. So he kind of pauses most, but not all, of these tariffs on Canada and Mexico to kind of stabilize the situation. And he sort of says, we'll negotiate lots of negotiations with the Canadians and Mexico. So that's sort of the first set of things he does in a second. The next thing he has done, and which he is continuing to roll out, including this week, but which he starts back in March. Remember I said that during his first term he was worried about strategic products, in particular steel and aluminum. So this time around, he has said, and his advisors said very publicly, there's a whole slate of products that they think are strategic products that the U.S. should make or mine or process more of here in the U.S. So he has started these legal processes, some of which have come to fruition, some of which are very much underway, to impose a bunch of product-specific tariffs on things he wants to make here. So he's got steel and aluminum. He kind of resurrected what he did during his first term and expanded it. He's doing this on copper. He's doing this on semiconductors. He's doing this on pharmaceutical products, drug products, a lot of which are now made outside the United States. And he's also talking about doing it potentially on some other products coming down the pipe. So we're seeing a really focus on these product-based tariffs as well. And it's clear talking to his advisors that for these product-based tariffs, he doesn't have any intention of negotiating with foreign governments ever. That's like, you know, you gotta make that stuff here before you gotta pay it. Then what's the third thing he did? So then on April 2nd, Liberation Day, he'd been touting it, and he called it his Liberation Day, he announces what is unequivocally the largest tariff increase since 1930, and what is very likely, and I'll talk about all the pros and cons, but very likely, if I understand, the largest tax increase of any kind since Bill Clinton asked Congress to raise taxes in 1996 to balance the budget. So a very major set of tariff actions that he announced on April 2nd. What was it? Broke down basically into two categories. First, 10% on pretty much everything. That's a universal tariff. We're going to have a 10% universal tariff. You're importing a few exceptions to it, like these USMCA, these Canada and Mexico products are kind of exempted from that, but basically 10%. You are buying mango from the Philippines today and importing it, 10%. And then he also announced that same day what he called reciprocal tariffs, kind of conceptually this idea that we should tariff them the same way they tariff us. They had a long conversation I need to get into now about how he calculated this. But he announced these things he called reciprocal tariffs. Not really reciprocal in any meaningful way, but called them reciprocal tariffs that vary for more than 60 countries, that vary between kind of, that 10% baseline up to about 40% for some countries. And the rate was sort of calculated as this is what it might take in order to balance the trade deficit with these countries, right? So they're tariffing us, we should tariff them the same. We will calculate what reciprocity means. We'll tariff them at a rate that there'd be no trade deficit with that country. Now, there's some obvious, economists have criticized the math. There's some obvious problems in this. They quite literally listed a reciprocal tariff for an island in the South Pacific that has no human beings living on it. It's inhabited solely by penguins. So there's some sort of obvious rush job problems with the way they got this out the door, but that was the goal of what they were doing. Markets went crazy, right? I mean, the stock markets, bond markets went totally crazy over this. This is when we all lost, like 12, 15% of our retirement portfolios in the course of a couple of days. Trump backs down largely and says for every country except China, those reciprocal tariffs we're freezing. We're not going to collect those. Now, we will collect the 10%, but we're not going to collect these higher reciprocal tariffs. But then he has kind of he's gotten rid of these reciprocal tariffs on most countries. He really hikes the tariffs on China. Partly that's because he's getting into a fight with China on various issues. Partly that's because China had retaliated on, remember I said Trump had already imposed 20%? China had retaliated to that, so Trump really wants to hit the Chinese back hard because they retaliated. So over the course of a couple of days, while he's cutting most of these reciprocal tariffs, he hikes tariffs on China up to an additional, on top of the 20%, on top of all these prior tariffs, he hikes tariffs up to another 125%. So, if you're buying, you want to buy a replacement office chair there from China, get it shipped in. Right now, you're going to be paying 170% tariff on that chair. You're going to pay the 25% on that chair for its first term. Then you're going to pay the 20% on this fentanyl issue. And then you're going to pay the 125% that he announced 2 weeks ago. So the raw math of this suggests, unless the U.S. is trying to strike a deal pretty soon, he has exempted some products, including iPhones, just recently. But unless you strike it, most trade with China is going to dry up. Because it just doesn't, no one's going to buy chairs with these tariffs in place. We'll sort of see where that goes. Now, that brings me to the third topic I want to talk about tonight, which is what do I think the logic of all of this is? What do I think, so talk about what Trump did. What do I think he's actually trying to achieve with all of these different tariffs? And as I see it, I think he and his administration, it's been very chaotic. They clearly have different goals. I'm not sure they've squared up all these goals of how they actually fit together. But I think if you talk to his advisor, or talk to some of his advisors, you read his statements, you read the statements of his advisors, and I think you can kind of, for all the chaos that is out there, you can kind of discern 4 goals out of these tariffs. So the first goal, and he's been talking about this going back to his campaign, is to raise revenue for the federal government. I mentioned that in the 19th century, literally more than half of federal revenue came from tariffs. And I think Trump, he's very public, says he wants to raise tariffs because he wants to get revenue to pay for income tax cuts. And in fact, he'll even go and say, we should get rid of the income tax, only have tariffs. Any economist will say that's fanciful. You just cannot raise enough money off the tariffs to replace the income tax. So it's not going to happen. It's just the factual world, it's not going to happen. But you could raise a lot more money through tariffs than we have over the last 30 years. You could take tariff revenue, which prior to this year, last year, tariff revenue was like 1 or 2% of all the money the federal government brought in. You could probably take that up to 10%. People pay it. We all pay these tariffs. So you import something, you pay it. But you could raise money that way. And then you could use that to pay for some deficit reduction or tax cuts or something. So I guess he very clearly has a revenue goal here coming out of these tariffs. I think the second goal he has is that he does want to cut some deals. He wants to show, I am getting better terms for American companies abroad. For too long, American companies have been unfairly taken advantage of overseas. We can argue whether this is true or not, but Trump clearly thinks it is true, and he wants these tariffs to be some leverage to go to the Europeans and go to the Japanese and say, you got to give American companies more access to your markets overseas. And then I think his third goal, and again, he talked about his campaign, he talks about a lot, he wants to see more manufacturing here in the United States. And he has a view that if you raise tariffs high enough, you're going to make it cheaper to build the stuff here in the United States, and that's going to, make more manufacturing happen here in the United States. Now, if your goal is to raise manufacturing in the United States, I think historically you could say, tariffs can be a tool there. I will say the breadth of the tariffs that he has imposed, probably not the best way to do that. I'll give an example. So I think we would all agree, most people in Washington anyway would agree, we should build more computer chips here in the United States. And for 5-6 years now, there's been some programs to try to get more computer chip manufacturing built in the United States. If you want to build more computer chips in the United States, you need these very high-end machines to do that. Most of these machines today, not all, but most of them, are made in Europe and in Japan. And that's not because American companies started building them over there. So these machines were actually invented by Dutch companies and Japanese companies. And there's just a simple fact that if you want to build computer chips in the United States, and some of these machines cost $100 million a piece, and you're now going to have 10 to 20 some odd % tariffs on these things to bring them in, you're not actually making it cheaper to build the computer chips here in the United States. So, at the very least, I would posit, I think he does want to have more manufacturing in the United States. The very broad set of tariffs he has imposed probably fairly poorly targeted to doing that. So I think the third goal is clearly manufacturing. And then I think there's a sort of fourth goal, at least here or there, scattershot, which is he kind of sees tariffs for geopolitical leverage. Remember I said his first tariffs on China, first tariffs on Canada, Mexico, were in theory at least about fentanyl. And he's also talked generally about using tariffs in this way too, whereas when Larry and I worked together, we were talking a lot about sanctions on Iran. Trump kind of doesn't like sanctions. He'd rather have tariffs as part of his solution. But he thinks of them as this kind of geopolitical tool as well. So I think you have these sort of four goals. And I actually think that if you put aside the chaos, it's been really chaotic in a way that really undermines U.S. business confidence, undermines investment. But if you put aside the chaos, you could arguably see a certain logic here. So if you want to raise revenue, you have this 10% universal tariff. You want some leverage with the foreigners, so you have these reciprocal tariffs. You have these products you really want to make here, so you have these product-specific tariffs. And then you threaten these kind of, I'll tariff you if you don't do X, Y, or Z geopolitical thing that I don't like. So I think there is, for all the chaos that we have seen, I think there is actually a bit of a logic that is coming out of this. Now, what do I think is good or bad, or where do I think we're at? Just a couple of minutes of closing remarks. Well, the first thing on the kind of good and bad, again, I think it's very hard to defend the chaotic nature of this and the breadth of it. I gave kind of an example around semiconductor manufacturing. The other thing I would say is, even if your goal is to bring manufacturing back, having tariffs like come in, exist for 72 hours, and go off, might come back in 3 weeks, that actually isn't good for any kind of business looking to make an investment anywhere. So I think if you do want to use these tariffs for these goals, I think they... Did it?
Yeah.
The battery's flashing. There we go. How's that? Is that on? We can hear you.
We can hear you.
All right. So what I would say is, so you have these manufacturing. Sorry. So if you want to bring them on, your tariffs are too broad. And then the other thing I would say is you need more, certainty and predictability to these. No, is it on? Yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So you need more certainty and predictability to this. The other thing we need to be clear on is that tariffs are a tax. I think Trump has this idea that tariffs are paid by the foreign person selling us. Maybe he thinks they're paid by the foreign government selling us something. And just mechanically, that isn't true. Mechanically, if you import something in the United States, and you're the importer, you have to pay Customs and Border Protection the tariff before they release it to you. So very mechanically, the tariffs are being paid by the companies that are importing things into the United States. Now, it is possible that those companies may, don't have to pay a tariff, get a discount from their supplier abroad. It's possible that those companies decide, you know what, I don't want to raise prices for my customer, so I'll eat it out of profit. And then, of course, it's possible they'll pass the cost on us. Economic studies historically suggest a lot of the cost does end up getting passed on to the consumer. So these are not cost-free tariffs. These are tariffs that are going to have real costs. And if we're going to debate the pros and cons, we should debate them like we debate any other tax. You got to raise money for government somehow. Like, what are the pros and cons of these tariffs? I think we need to have an open and clear discussion about that. The other thing we need to think about, because, like the world's a dynamic place, other countries have views. When you impose tariffs like this, Trump thinks he's going to get deals out of these countries. I hope he gets deals out of these countries. But it does take two countries to get to a deal. And, those countries might decide they want a deal. They've certainly indicated many of them, they indicated they want to get a deal. A lot of countries sent trade ministers and the like to Washington over the last couple of weeks. But if these other countries don't like the deal that's on the table, they always have the option of retaliating against us, right? They have the option of saying, we're going to tariff the stuff you sell us. We're going to go after the companies that are operating, the American companies that are operating here in Europe, and we're going to raise taxes of our own on them. So I think that if we're going to have any chance of successful outcome here, that results in actually kind of deals that might open markets, might be good for us, you're actually going to have to see a lot of diplomacy. Just as we were talking about at the beginning, because if you don't have a lot of diplomacy here, and if it's not deft diplomacy, if we don't recognize that our trading partners have a set of views of their own, a set of policy tools of their own, a set of their own political interests, they're just going to start whacking us, and we're going to get into these long and protracted trade wars that I don't think are going to accomplish any of those goals that President Trump has. And so I guess what I would say is we are, sort of in the early days of a process that is likely to play out, not just over the course of this year, but over the course of a couple of years, where we are going to, at the end of that, probably see some combination of higher tariffs. We'll be paying higher tariffs. How high, we don't know. Some combination of deals. I think we will get some deals. Deals may still have some higher tariffs. There will be lower tariffs than otherwise would be. And we're going to see some combination of, maybe some manufacturing increasing, but also if we get into trade wars, manufacturing decreasing because foreigners won't buy as many of the products, like Gulfstream jets, that we make just down the road here. So I think it really remains to be seen where we're headed. And it's going to continue to keep me employed, and it's going to continue to keep all of you interested in headlines over the next couple of years. So I think I will leave it there, and look forward to the discussion and the questions.
Peter, thank you so much. You know, when we had dinner with Peter just before we came here, and as he was coming down the street from arriving here from Atlanta, he was on the phone doing an interview. Because this is one of those people. Is it okay if I call you a Washington person?
Sure.
I
live in Atlanta. I live in Washington. I actually live in Atlanta now.
No, right. But this is where people go to find out, actually, give me an accurate view of what is happening. Not colored by politics, but a very sharp analytical mind that can cut through all of this. And this is what journalists come to Peter for. This is what he writes about. By the way, you can follow him on LinkedIn. Okay, you can follow him on LinkedIn like thousands of others. So now you get to do what that reporter was doing on the way in here to dinner, which is to ask Peter a question. I will, because we don't have a mic, I'm going to ask you to stand and start first. I'll call on people one by one. But go ahead, sir.
You've been talking mostly about trade in goods, but in modern times there's more and more trade in services. And especially with Europe, while we do have a deficit in trade of goods, if you include services, it's balanced. Now, is that taken into account into the policy of the current government, or I mean, it seems like we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
So I think this is a great question. So it is very true. Certainly when we talk about Trump and tariffs, Trump certainly talks about, most of us are talking about goods, chairs, cars, airplanes, physical things. But one, as you say, sir, one of the most important sets of U.S. exports is services. And services includes everything. When we think about services exports from the United States, it includes everything from, like Morgan Stanley Bank doing deals for European and Japanese companies, which obviously very profitable for Morgan Stanley Bank. So it includes everything from that to actually one thing that counts as services export. You don't think of it as an export, but if a French student comes and studies at SCAD, that actually counts from an economic perspective as a services export, because we are providing education to a foreigner. So you have this whole mix of and then of course the big services export of the last 20 years has been software, right? And we don't, we think about tariffs on goods. Really, no one tries to tariff, Microsoft's sale of Microsoft Word in, Europe or Japan. So the huge software exports for very high value, right? These people make a lot of money selling software services around the world. And it's very, very fair. And the Europeans kind of raised this with the Trump administration. You've got to look at services. And if you think about the economy, the services really matter. And, we think about the U.S. as having about $1 trillion trade deficit. That is a goods trade deficit. We buy about $1 trillion a year more in goods than we sell. Our services, it's harder to calculate. Goods have the advantage, it's easy to calculate because like it shows up at the Port of Savannah and you see it, whereas it's hard to calculate all the software sales around the world, and the banking and legal services and that kind of thing. But it's probably like shrinks the trade deficit by 50%, something like that, globally, when you count the services exports. I think we should focus on services. I think it is fair for other governments to point out, hey, if you're going to tariff our goods, and the European Union is thinking about this, if you're going to tariff our goods more, maybe we'll start taxing those tech companies that are, making a lot of money here in Europe. I think that is a fair negotiation for the Europeans to put on the table to try to, work out a deal here. I think we should be thinking about that. I think for Trump, who knows why he only thinks about that. But I do think one of the reasons, like the fair reason, might be, his history. I mean, we all psychoanalyze our president forever, and I don't think that's very fruitful. I will say, though, I think that in fairness to him and some of his kind of trade hawk advisors, their view is a little bit that they want a trade policy that focuses more on middle-class type jobs here in the United States. And a lot of that historically has been manufacturing. So they will kind of own up. They're worried less about like the software engineers in New York and California. And that might be good or bad policy, right? Big argument, good or bad. But that's actually, I think, part of why they're not. They will sort of forthrightly own. It's not the kind of jobs the industry is worried about. Now, again, I think it is fair for the Europeans to say, we're going to make you worry about that as part of this negotiation we're now having. And we'll sort of see how that plays out.
Our president has this false nostalgia about 1905 and McKinley and all these great tariffs that were done, and it turned out to be the most disastrous return, and it never worked. And on top of that, in 1770 and 1780, we felt the greatest depression up until 1925, and what was the reason? People stopped buying our goods. So we're going to make all this great manufacturing here. We're going to send all this stuff out because everybody's going to buy it. But the real issue is, what if they don't? So what are you going to do with this stuff? And the worst of all is our farmers who have spent 2 decades developing relationships with China, and they're sending their soybeans and everything else. They're dead. And where's it going? To Brazil. So the world actually has an ability to stop this false thinking simply by not buying. So what happens when that starts to occur?
I just want to say we were at, I'm nowadays, so I actually served in the Biden administration. I'm now in the analysis business, not in the moral, this is good or bad business, by and large, for these kind of presentations. I very much agree with you. It's sort of similar to the other point. Like, if Trump proves unable to get some deals here, and if he just moves forward with the sweep of tariffs that he has threatened and brings back these reciprocal tariffs, we don't get deals, and the other countries are retaliating against us. If that's the world we end up in the next couple of months, I think it's going to end quite badly for us. I think we are going to find the uncertainty is going to deter investment here. We're going to find a bunch of our foreign markets for whether manufactured goods or services goods are going to dry up. As you say, farmers are going to bear the brunt of it because they are producing, commodities. Brazilian soybean, basically the same as our soybeans, right? So it is something that's very easy for the other countries to substitute away from. So I think there's a quite plausible scenario where this goes quite pear-shaped in the next couple of months and things go badly. I think the scenario that avoids bad outcomes, and where maybe you see some plausible outcomes. Well, I see 2 scenarios where you see some plausibly good outcomes. So the first scenario is just like Trump actually retreats on his ambitions and takes a much more targeted, not just sort of 50% more targeted, but like 90% more targeted approach to his tariffs. Because I do think there's sort of, in some of these product tariffs, I think he's going a little too broad. But I do think there's a plausible argument that we should be making more of what are called rare earth elements. These are things that go into defense manufacturing, kind of specialty product. China makes 80–90% of them now, we need them for defense. I think there's a plausible argument. So, we need some tariffs for like that make it here. It's going to cost us more, but national security needs, we should make it here. I think you could have a much more targeted trade agenda that serves some national security and economic interest. I think if he wants to pursue this really expansive agenda and not have it blow up in our face, he better cut some deals. And he better actually show that he can cut those deals, which will involve not reimposing all the tariffs. And we're just going to have to see how his administration plays that out.
Here, over here.
Yes.
So we have manufacturing and we have services. So what about the food imports, like coffee and?
Paying 10%? I mean, this is one, like, that's right, go ahead, sorry.
I know, but this is, it's going to take several years to get manufacturing up and going in this country. But in the meantime, we need to feed ourselves. And most people don't have a garden in their backyard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so here we are. They can cut us off and not necessarily starve us, but we won't have coffee in the morning.
Some parts of this, I think, just are like actually don't make a lot of sense, right? So I very much agree. Like, there's some foodstuffs we just can't grow. I mean, I guess you can grow a little bit of highly priced coffee in Hawaii, but you basically, by the climate, can't grow coffee in the United States. So if you're going to tariff coffee, you're just making all of us waking up in the morning more expensive. You're not creating any jobs here. Like, maybe that's how you want to raise revenue, right? I mean, we've had sin taxes for many years. The other thing I want to say on the food, there's another interesting point on the food, and it relates to the farmer question. So we actually grow a bunch of crops here in the United States, like soybeans in particular, that we don't eat that much of here. They're grown for the export market. Because, yes, we do eat some, edamame and tofu, soy salad. We don't eat it as much as Chinese do. And if we get into these trade wars and they stop buying soybeans, we all better start eating a lot, less coffee and mangoes and a lot more, and fruit from Latin America and a lot more soybeans, because that's what our nutritional stack's going to look like. And I think this is going to be a real challenge. I mean, seriously, I think this is going to be a real challenge.
Well, all I got to say is, for all of the coffee drinkers in this country that wake up and want that cup of coffee, and we can't have our cup of coffee, watch out, Washington.
Yes.
So the whole manufacturing thing makes no sense to me. It takes years and years to rebuild manufacturing. Why in the world is he focused so much on manufacturing? It's that, he doesn't want to help factory workers. I can't figure out why he cares a damn about manufacturing other than pretense. Let's pretend that we're going to go do something, but without any substance.
So, again, I'm going to try and be in the analysis. No, I appreciate it. So, I think there are, and again, psychoanalyze the mind of our president, sort of why he, from 1980, loves car manufacturing. From a substantive perspective of why should we have more manufacturing, if you talk to his administration, right, why? What do they do? Well, so you hear kind of a couple of arguments, some of which to me are more plausible than others. So there is this argument that comes up, not necessarily in cars, although they will talk about it in cars, that, for some kind of, we are in this more and more dangerous world where we have this China challenge we're facing, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we need to have some manufacturing base in the U.S. for national security purposes. Now that's not all manufacturing, but you do hear we need some kinds of more manufacturing here for not really the economy, but for national security purposes. And an example that's being talked about more and more in Washington now of that is shipbuilding. We basically, although we build pleasure boats, motor boats, sort of Boston whalers and things here, we basically don't build the large container ships that come in. And China is now, next year, going to build more than half the global book of large container ships. And I think there is an argument when it comes to ships. you do want to have, for defense purposes, some ability to build ships here, right? If we ever have to scale up, you want industry. And I also think there's an argument that in a world, like picture 5, 10 years from now, in a world where China has built 70%, say, of the world shipping fleet, if we get there, that's the trajectory we're on without intervention. Because, you know, if you're mayors, if you're a big shipping lane, you just buy the cheapest shipping sector. We're in a world where China's built 70% of the world shipping fleet. Suppose we get into a conflict with China. All those boats are connected online. All those boats are totally running on software. All those boats that would ship us all of our imports and exports, well, the Chinese could probably turn them off. So I think there are, for some of these things, like we do need to think about the defense implications. Now that's probably, you know, 10, 20% of manufacturing. But I do think that comes up, and I think that is a legitimate reason. I think there's also there is this view across the administration, which you can share or not. I'm just saying this one's a view that some of them have, that like kind of some combination of romanticizes these manufacturing jobs and has kind of a view that, well, those are just, you know, sort of better, higher wage, not always borne out in the economics, but their view is they're kind of better, higher wage jobs than kind of comparable services jobs. So they just think a more manufacturing-oriented economy would result in higher kind of middle-class family incomes. There's a lot of economic debate about whether that's accurate, but that's the other piece of how they see it. Again, putting aside the whole, like, Donald Trump, you know, walked a factory when he, like, 1982 and loved it. That I can't speak to.
We have a question over here, and then we're going to go to the middle after that. So right here.
Thanks for the summary. That was really an excellent summary. I have two quick things. One, a tariff is a tax, and the tariff goes into the federal general fund, as I understand it, just like an income tax. But unlike an income tax, which is a progressive tax, although not as progressive as it used to be, tariff is more of a flat tax or a regressive tax, and it seems like there's, you know, it's not helping the middle-class guy like the income tax is, and I wonder if you could comment on that. The second point I wanted to ask you about was we're putting up a tariff on chips coming in because we want to build up our capacity, but I thought Biden had this CHIPS Act that's trying to encourage manufacturing here, and I thought that Trump was kind of taking that down and chipping away at that, so to speak.
I mean, so let me answer your first question. So yeah, tariff is a tax. Mechanically, it is paid by the person who is getting the thing out of customs. It is a tax. And pretty much and I think if we view it as a tax, and if we're thinking about tariffs for revenue purposes, we should say, well, it's a tax, right? We're trying to raise revenue. Like, what's the benefit of this tax versus some other tax, right? If the point is a tax, think about it as a tax, the pros and cons. You are absolutely correct, sir. Every economic analysis shows that tariffs tend to be pretty regressive, you know, sort of disproportionate or fall relatively a little bit heavier on lower and middle income people. And that actually comes to the coffee comment. You know, if you're a lower income, middle income person, you tend to spend most of your money on stuff, right? You're spending most of your income. You're out buying the things you need day to day. And so actually, for middle income people, like, tariffs affect most of what they buy. Whereas if you're a higher income person, you're saving a lot of money, you're not, you know, paying any tariffs on that. Maybe you're buying various services, you're going out to eat and all this kind of stuff. So actually, just like the economic modeling shows, it is a pretty regressive tax. And that is, if you're thinking about it as a tax, it's like a con to the tax. Maybe there are other benefits, but it is a pretty regressive tax. On the semiconductors, yeah, I will say there is also an element, you know, Trump clearly sees tariffs manufacturing. There is like an element of our president where he just, you know, he loves tariffs, right? I mean, he said this, right? He's like, tariffs is my favorite word in the English language, right? Or maybe it's whatever, most beautiful word, something like that. But he loves it. And I do think that means he takes this sort of, without having kind of an integrated, nuanced policy, just wants a tariff. And so you're exactly right. Biden's approach, Biden also thought And in fact, Trump during his first term thought we should build more computer chips in the US. And so Trump started, didn't get it passed. He actually started, and then Biden got it passed, this thing called the CHIPS Act, which basically provided some subsidies to build semiconductor factories in the United States. And actually, over the last 5 years, the semiconductor companies, both American ones like Intel and Micron, and then foreign ones like TSMC, a big Taiwanese company, they've announced something like $200 billion of investment in semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. So that was kind of working because you're giving them some incentives. I do think, and this kind of illustrates some of the chaotic nature of policymaking, Trump is both talking about walking back those incentives, and then he's talking about tariffing the machines these companies need to buy to put in those factories that the incentives were meant to build. And I think that is just not a policy that is gonna work out all that well, right? I think it's just not, right? And I think we had another example. I mean, this is like a friend of mine who's at CFR. If you're interested in tariffs, Brad Setzer is his name. He's at CFR. He has pointed out to me. So we import a lot of our drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, from Europe, and there are various reasons for that. One of the big reasons, a lot of the drugs are like invented in Europe. I mean, we invent a lot here, but you know, like Ozempic was invented in the Netherlands or Germany or something like that. And so we import them from over there. Now, if Trump tariffs pharmaceuticals, that is going, you know, that'll be a price increase on imported pharmaceuticals. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to who the largest payer in the United States of pharmaceutical tariffs will be? U.S. government through Medicare. So there's kind of a weird little circularity of that, too, that I think they probably need to think through.
Mr. Harrell, you touched on, apparently everything is ringing on my phone. You touched on specifically students not coming over to the United States to learn being a big part of like brain drain or whatever. You have, what, a couple of weeks ago, you had South Korea, Vietnam, and China enter into a trade agreement, which is unheard of because those three countries have an epic hatred of each other. Not only economically, but back to social things. My question is it worth the loss of emerging markets, both to countries that are in like the BRICS or into ASEAN? Is it worth the loss of introduction into these emerging markets from Africa and things like that on this tariff policy? Because it's just going to make the tariffs that Donald Trump is putting on, it's just going to make countries just not want to deal with us in general, both because of the volume of tariffs and because of the uncertainty of how they're put together.
Yeah, so I want to give two parts to my answer to that question. I very much appreciate it. So the first part, and I didn't talk a lot, just too many topics we could talk about, but you know, when I talked about that kind of period in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, the sort of trade liberalization period. One of the other goals that was sort of a geopolitical goal, sort of an economic goal of that trade liberalization period was a development goal. So I talked about WTO. There were some other things that were done that were sort of smaller, but there were these things that are called trade preference programs for like lower income African countries and a couple of other lower income countries. And the idea there was, you know, kind of a development orient. You know, we want these countries to develop. That's good for them, good for us, helps our security interests, you know, maybe creates markets over time, and is also just like, you know, builds a relationship with these countries. And Trump is throwing all that out. And if we're not going to use trade preference programs as part of our development toolkit, and if we want and think global development is a good thing, we're going to have to find some other tools to do global development. I know Donald Trump has also dismantled the largest U.S. government development agency, USAID. Maybe we don't think we should do development. Yeah, I think that's probably some of Trump's. But if you think we should do development, and you're not going to do it through trade, you got to come up with some other tool to do it. The other thing, and I think this is a real issue that I think, you know, during Trump's first term, he really focused on China. You know, other things he did, but he really focused on China. And I think the way in which he has tariffed everybody, and especially these reciprocal tariffs. And some of these high reciprocal tariffs are on, we think of these high, they're suspended, but you think of them as being on like Japan or Europe, but they're also on like little small developing countries, many of them. I do think that has a real diplomatic sting. And we are definitely, as you say, seeing China as a geopolitical rival trying to step into the breach there and take advantage of this opportunity to kind of build their own geopolitical relationships. And so you mentioned the sort of trading arrangements. I also saw in the news earlier this week that Chinese President Xi Jinping was in Vietnam signing like a whole bunch of trade and development cooperation agreements, and we're there like saying we're going to put 40% tariffs on you, and that definitely is going to shape how the Vietnamese see us versus China. Now, I do think that like China's not, we are a bigger market for foreign countries selling us stuff than China is for foreign countries selling China stuff. Hands down, we are. So it's not like China can really replace the economic role we play with these countries, but it can definitely step in diplomatically and try and capitalize on this situation. And we see the Chinese very actively over the last month trying to do that. And I do think that's something, if you're worried about China as a strategic rival, not just kind of they undercut our manufacturing, if you're worried about them as a strategic rival, I do think you need to be thinking about the diplomatic kind of side of this as well.
You're over here.
So different cultures have different negotiating styles, and many of them are more patient than Americans. And how do you think this part of cultures will play out in these negotiations?
Well, no, serious note, I appreciate the question. I could also say, all of us have sat through an hour and a half on tariffs, now we seem patient. But no, I very much take your, serious note, I very much take your point. I actually think, and I think this cultural thing, and this cultural kind of misfit is actually part of why the US-China trade war has gotten so sharp so quickly. I think, Trump, when he first imposed so he threatened these tariffs on sort of Canada, Mexico, and China back in February all at the same time. And Canada, then Prime Minister Trudeau, like within a half a day, had flown to meet with Trump. And Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, also within a day, had made some comments threatening retaliation, but also sort of told Trump, I'll deal with you on the border. And Xi Jinping didn't really say anything other than to criticize the tariffs. And so tariffs start going in on China. And then a month later, Trump puts another 10% on China. And I think one of the things that's happening here is Trump thought, well, I'll put tariffs on China, and Xi Jinping, be like Trudeau, he'll come and kind of come to my court and, sort of offer concessions. And that just isn't what was going to happen with Xi Jinping, right? To your point of negotiation culture, that's just not how it was going to happen. And so I do think this kind of not understanding negotiation culture, if you want to get deals, you have to understand the negotiation culture of the person you're trying to deal with. And so I think we do need to be thinking about that if we want to get to get to deals. On this kind of broader issue of patience, I think it'll be interesting. Tariffs or taxes. If he actually kind of keeps these things in place as he negotiates, you're going to see prices come up. Talked to folks in Europe over the last week or two. We've seen the market hits, and there's a view in Europe of, we want to, sure, we'd love to negotiate with him, but also maybe you guys in the U.S. should feel some pain from these kind of things for a couple of months, and then maybe you'll be willing to make us a better deal. So I think it is going to be interesting to see how much patience we all have for this to play out. Yes, sir.
One of the themes underlying Trump's moves is the issue of fairness. Maybe that's not the right word, but we charge them X and they charge us 4X. And he wants to resolve that. Do you think that's exaggerated? And the other one, of course, are the non-tariff factors that affect imports as well. One of the best was 30 years ago, Japan wanted to put restrictions on American skis because Japanese snow was different than Americans. I mean, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So could you address those two separately?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate the question. So first, it is true that when the U.S. came into the WTO, that we agreed to lower tariff rates than most other WTO members. Hands down, that's true. So to give an example, we basically agreed, the WTO, that our average tariff rate, varies by product, but our average tariff rate was sort of about 3%. The European Union agreed at the WTO that their average tariff rate, I don't know, call it 5%, I think it may be 4.8. So still not high, but like, 50% higher than ours. In some countries like India, their rate was, I think, 18. And so you can ask, well, why, I mean, it is appealing, like, why isn't there reciprocity in this system? And I think, I think there is a sort of a moral and an economic appeal to the reciprocity argument. The reason there isn't reciprocity, just as a historical matter, is that at the time there was kind of a view, again, right or up, there's kind of a view of, well, like, because these tariffs are taxes on stuff we import, even if the Indians aren't willing to bring their tariffs down, we'd rather not pay taxes on the stuff we buy from them. You could argue with it, but there's a view of like, actually, let's just lower the prices here. There was also an assumption at the time that just, again, proved wrong. Kind of like some of our assumptions around China, just proved wrong. There was an assumption that like, oh, well, we will set an example by having low tariffs, and as these other countries grow and develop, they will see that's a smarter approach and they'll bring their tariffs down too. That just proved wrong. Like they didn't, right? We thought they would and they just didn't. And so I think it is fair in this world we're in for Trump to say we should have more reciprocity in this. I think that's a fair debate to be had. Again, you got to negotiate these things. I think it's a fair debate. On the non-tariff barriers, so non-tariff barriers, you say like the skis. This also comes up a lot. Countries will do things like if they'll have some like security audit for U.S. software that's all trumped up and really just trying to keep the U.S. firm. And if you read the day before Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs, his trade representative put out this very, very, very long report, 200-300 pages. That's kind of like, here's what we see as the trade problems we have with about 80 different countries. And a lot of those, for a lot of those countries, are non-tariff barriers of different kinds. And I think that, I don't know exactly what the negotiations between the U.S. and the Japanese and the U.S. and the Koreans are. But I'm going to assume that, some of the things the U.S. is tabling is we'd like to see some progress on these non-tariff barriers, here.
Peter, I have one last question.
Yeah. Councilman.
And then we will offer all of you some advice before we go. Go ahead.
Peter, this has been an absolute joy. Thank you for coming to our city, and for Larry for bringing you down. So let's have some fun with your last question here. I'm going to ask you the same question twice, once as an economist and once as a politician. You can choose which one you'd like to answer here. So as an economist, the #1 agricultural industry in Georgia, of course, is poultry. It is an extraordinarily valuable part of our economy. How do you explain the paradox between raising these tariffs and protectionist policies, which are raising the costs and the inputs for American farmers and this particular industry? And to ask you as a politician, how is this supposed to lower the price of eggs?
Councilman, let me assure you the deal's going to be great. Those egg prices are coming down. Thank you guys so much.
Just one more word from Peter before you all go, and then I have a small announcement to make about our next speaker. But when we were at dinner, I asked Peter, who do you read? Who do you listen to, to follow along in this debate? besides yourself, of course. And as I mentioned, he's on LinkedIn, and he can tell you where else you can find him. He's also obviously at the Carnegie Endowment. But any advice for our audience on how they stay abreast over the debate over tariffs in hopefully a factual and accurate way?
So I'll give 3 references, 2 of which are kind of fairly straight up factual, and one of which is a little bit more opinionated. The very factual, so I write sort of about once a week on LinkedIn. I write a sort of here's what happened this week kind of thing, very factual sort of thing. But that aside, so the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, has this thing called their Real Econ Initiative that publishes some opinion pieces, but they also are sort of publishing just like, charts. Here's kind of how you can see where tariffs today stand versus a month ago, versus 2 months ago, and some sort of explainers on the legal side of this, very complicated legal. So CFR's, Council on Foreign Relations, Real Econ Initiative, has a lot of factual stuff. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, also, or PIIE, also has a sort of a factual, they got a guy named Chad Bone, B-O-W-N, publishes a lot of just like factual economic, that's less sort of the policy, that's more just pure economic analysis. The more sort of policy and kind of is it going to work or not is a person named Oren Cass. And Oren is with something called American Compass. Oren was a longtime advisor to J.D. Vance when Vance was in the Senate, and actually when Vance was running for the Senate. And Oren publishes a weekly newsletter called Understanding American Economics or something like that. And that gives I think Oren, and he worked for Vance and with Vance for many, many years. And I think that Oren does a good job, sort of fair job of like, what are these guys trying to accomplish? That is neither kind of from the administration, I'm going to defend 100% of this like to the letter with every I and T, but kind of somebody works with these guys, what are they trying to accomplish, but also here are a couple of missteps. And I think that's been like an interesting take on it.
Well, thank you. Benefited from it. I apologize because there was a mistaken date on the slide that you saw about our next speaker. Ambassador Philip Rieker will be here May 15th, Thursday, May 15th, okay? And we'll change that, it'll be right on the website. I had an exchange with Ambassador Rieker just today, so he will be coming back from Europe on May 14th. And coming to speak to you on May 15th. He's going to be spinning off of the theme of the 80th anniversary of VE Day in Europe, which is, we're pretty close to that. So he'll be talking about giving you context of that, but very much bringing it up to our present relations with U.S., between the United States and Europe. So I hope you all can make it May 15th here. Thank you.